So like Brexit clearly was something that challenged a lot of the maybe the institutions that had been crumbling sort of behind the scenes in their effectiveness, and it really like laid out some of the problems with a lot of our modern institutions. Like, do you think COVID's actually gone and pushed that to a whole new level of watching like the dysfunction of the press, or of parliament generally, to be able to hold government to account, or legislate for things in the 21st century? Do you think it's kind of like laid bare a lot of the problems with our institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that the main issue in my view that COVID has flagged up is the fact that as a nation we remain one of the most centralized in Europe, or possibly even the world, in terms of how many levers Whitehall has to pull compared to how many levers can be pulled at a local level. And whereas other countries, Germany in particular, for instance, had a system to deal with COVID that was one that was delivered by local authorities and regionally, yes, with advice and support from central government, but was able to do that much more effectively, whereas the UK automatically, and I would say partly through political dogma, thought that the solution to this would be to get in Serco or Capita or whichever, or Deloitte, to run things from the centre. Unfortunately, often appointing people who seem to have quite close connections with the Prime Minister or people around him, not necessarily appointed on merit, who have then created an absolute shambles in terms of a test and trace system, which it still isn't functioning, even though billions of pounds has been spent at it. And I think ideologically, the government didn't want to rely on local authorities because they've never had an agenda which is about giving power to local authorities, something that I, as an organisation, Unlock Democracy, is very much in favour of. And we're now, I think, suffering the consequences of trying to tackle it in a centralised way. So I think that's, for me, the main lesson that we've learned. And I mean, I'm worried that we will, a bit like the Brexit issue, in my view, that we will end up with such mistrust of government, of doctors, vaccines, that the whole thing will become, really hard to get the nation to respond collectively to an issue, and that it'll become a bit of a, just as wearing a mask, not quite so much in the UK as it did in the US, became a bit of a sort of culture war, that we will now have whether or not to accept being vaccinated as part of a culture war. And I don't think that's very helpful. It's not very scientific. And I think longer term, there are decisions that we may think only affect us individually, but often have an impact on the people around us. I mean, I agree with you that I think what we haven't really had, and this I think is partly down to the way the government have handled this issue, is we haven't had perhaps the informed debate about the impact that COVID has had that we should have done. And it should include, obviously, the economic consequences, the mental health consequences, the impact on children. I must say that I have smiled rather wryly when I've listened to Conservative members of Parliament in the last few weeks saying how important it was that we had all the information out there about the impact of the government's proposals in relation to COVID. And I was thinking, a few years ago, we did actually have quite a big debate. It was about Brexit, wasn't it? Where we were calling for the government to make the evidence available of the economic impact of that. And those same people didn't seem to be quite as keen then. So yes, I think we do need to have all the information that's available, and the government haven't been willing to provide it. It's always been very late, if available at all. And if you want people to a bit like a citizens' assembly. If you want people to come to a collective conclusion on something, you need to be sharing much more of the information so that people feel they've been party to a decision rather than simply having it imposed on them from above.
I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that we had in terms of the entire COVID debate. Like you're right, it became so polarized, and that's a scary trend. I mean, we're going very much the direction of America in those kind of things, in which, like, if you said, you know, maybe wearing masks isn't as effective as we think, or, you know, maybe it's not that good for our mental health that we can't see anyone's faces, especially for like elderly folks or you have dementia, and it can be confusing. And the fact that we couldn't even have that discussion, like whether it was worth it, like trade-off wise, because it very well could be. Like, if you, I'm not enough of an expert on it, but, you know, I at least feel we could have had that discussion a little more openly than, if you're against this, you're a bad person who wants people to die. Like, that's not a healthy place to be with the debate. But, like, how do you see us trying to bridge that gap that we're trending towards in America? Because obviously there's been periods in the past where the country is polarized quite heavily, and then it's kind of swung back towards everyone being a little more centrist about it. And there's you know, theories that this is just kind of the way that populations go. Like, we swing to the extremes and then we come back to the middle. Do you think there's anything that we can do to try and, like, encourage a little more reasonable discussion amongst amongst like the populace and in Parliament, and amongst the people who are actually making the decisions, especially, as you say, to try and make people feel like they're party to the decisions that are being made, rather than it feels like a diktat being handed down from on high?
I'm keeping my fingers crossed that what has happened in the US will actually help that process. If Trump had continued as president, then I think this would have been, you know, an accelerating sort of degenerative. Well, I think I've got too many T's and I's in there, but process. So I hope that Biden and Biden has made a very clear pitch that he is the unity man. He's the person who's worked across the divide in the US, and I think he will genuinely attempt to do that. So the evidence that you referred to earlier about young people sort of supporting a populist approach, I think if you're referring to the survey that I'm aware of, I think what that confirmed was that they were supportive in the first term of a populist, but not necessarily in the second term. So it may be that people, you know, they can be amused by people like Trump and believe his rhetoric initially, that he was going to make America great again, and that he had the interests of the you know, the Rust Belt at heart. Whereas at the end of 4 years, when they look back at what he did in terms of, for instance, not being willing to reveal his own tax returns and implementing policies which overwhelmingly benefited the wealthiest in American society, that they may have been slightly put off by a populist appeal which actually didn't really deliver anything for them. So hopefully people will, you know, the US will be providing a different kind of example with Biden. I mean, how do we stop descending into a populist agenda? Maybe the departure of Dominic Cummings is part of that, because clearly his agenda has always been disruptive, take no prisoners, including prisoners within the Conservative Party. So his departure may in fact mean that the Prime Minister is going to try to play the part more of the London mayor character, who was bringing London together for the Olympics, rather than a disruptive person who was, you know, the bull in the china shop, who was going around smashing up all of our institutions, which is what Dominic Cummings was devoted to doing. So maybe the government have in fact taken that decision. Now, I mean, the Brexit agenda, which I think, I mean, you said, was that caused by our institutions? I suppose to some extent it was. It was caused by, I think, people feeling that there were certain parts of the country where they had no opportunity, or fewer opportunities than in London or the Southeast. And that is true. And the level of investment that we've seen in the Southeast has been greater. So one way of trying to address perhaps the inclination to support people who will promise anything to get to power is to actually see the levelling up agenda happening. Now, in an environment where COVID has absolutely sort of smashed the public public purse, so to speak, and created a level of indebtedness for the country that we haven't seen since the Second World War, if the Chancellor is genuinely committed to that levelling up agenda, he can only achieve that by, I would suggest, tax increases that are going to have to hit the richest hardest. I mean, we've got what, 100% borrowed 100% of GDP. I mean, we're unprecedented. That's not the sort of thing that you can easily resolve by, small tax increases and a little bit on VAT here, a little bit on income tax there. You've got to look at real, major items like capital gains tax, because otherwise we're going to be trying to, clear this deficit for the next 30 or 40 years. And as long as we're doing that, as long as we're paying back, trying to pay down the debt, there will be far less money available for that levelling up agenda. So, to heal the problems that we've got, that's got to happen. People in the Northeast, Northwest have got to feel that they're part of the UK. They're not the poor cousins, so to speak. And I suppose the final thing I would say is that perhaps one of the best ways of doing that is actually about devolution and giving their politicians, and we've seen it to some extent with people like Andy Burnham, for instance, give them more power to take decisions, because local politicians on the whole are slightly more trusted than national ones.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.